It's good to see you guys here tonight. This is a lot harder than it looks. Brother Kevin makes it look easy. But I know when God calls us to do His work, we know that God's going to show up. And this is extremely difficult for me. I am not one to speak in front of people, small groups, but I know that God's going to use me. So with that being said, Brother Joey, do you care to open us up in prayer?
Dear gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this privilege and honor that you've allowed us to come to your house of worship. And Father, we just pray that you be with Brother Kent as he brings a message to us, Father, a lesson. I pray for calmness of his nerves, Father. I pray that you would help us to open our minds and our hearts and be receptive. And Father, I pray that we would take this, and as we leave here, we would proclaim your word to those we come in contact with. I pray, Father, for those in our prayer request that we have each and every day. I pray, Father, that your will be done in each and every life. And for someone that does not know you, I pray that they would still feel that tug and draw upon you, Father, that they give their life to you before it is eternally too late. Keep us safe, Father, as we go back home tonight. Be with our pastor, Ms. Jennifer, as they're away from us. Forgive us what we fail you. In Christ's name, pray, amen.
Amen. So I'll start out with a little bit about myself. A lot of you may not know a whole lot about me. I live in Warm Springs. That's where I've grown up. Went to church at Warm Springs Free Will Baptist Church, and as a young boy, that's where I gave my life to God and saved, baptized there. And I'm very thankful for that church and the church family that we had out there. My mom's here tonight, and she was the one that would always take us to church. She was the backbone in the family. My dad, he wasn't always at church, but he made sure we went to church. My mom was there with us. If she wasn't there, the other adults in the church would get a hold of me and Jeremiah, because we would be the two in the front row fighting, seeing who can hold their legs up the longest, hold their breath the longest. And so we were a handful, but our church family loved us, and they poured into us, and I'm thankful for that. As a teenager, I had a small group of friends that God gave me an opportunity to be a light to and a witness to, but unfortunately, I let myself get in the way and not be that light, outwardly spoken to them. I felt like that I could just be a good person to them, and they can see Christ that way. I can tell you for most of them that didn't work, because I still have close friends today that don't know God, and it hurts. And I've let that be a crutch for me for a long time. Whenever I got asked to do the D group with Brother Kevin, that really helped me, the small group study, being able to open up when I never would, to lead a small group one day during the D group. It was a struggle. It was only 4 or 5 people, but God helped me through it. And being able to go to Jamaica, we did a small men's Bible study with one of the churches there, and God really moved that night. We started out with a small number, but by the end of it, we probably had 20. And we had no idea what to expect. But when we're willing to be used by God, things are changed. People are changed. And just because we don't know what's going to happen, God does. And tonight, I don't know what's going to happen. But I'm standing up here and being willing to be used by God. So as we go through these questions, they may seem pretty simple and pretty basic, but sometimes whenever we look at these questions about somebody else, it's easy to answer. But when we turn the question around and ask ourselves, it may get a little bit harder. And these questions, maybe they don't apply to the majority here, and maybe it was God put this on my heart for me. Because every time I would try to come up with something, He always put me back right here. Every time I try to change a question, put me right back here. And so tonight we're going to be in Jonah chapter 1 and chapter 3. So we'll start with chapter 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for the evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with him to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship, and had laid down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish. And they said to one another, Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you? And he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, What is this that you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said to him, What shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it has pleased you. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So as Jonah was trying to flee from the presence of the Lord, do we see a difference in the way that the Lord spoke to him? Yeah. Right. So God told him, to go. Do we see a difference throughout the chapter of how God spoke to him?
Kind of like whenever he was telling him to go, he was just talking to him, he didn't listen to him, he was mad about it.
Yeah.
When I lose my cool with my kid.
Right.
I told you to do something, you didn't listen to me.
You get a little more stern with them. So God told him, but as Jonah fled or tried to get away from the presence of the Lord, after that, do we see God speak to him? Yes. We do. And it's not so much as like we did in the first verse, but God spoke through the storm. And it got worse. Jonah knew that it was God. He didn't have to have a voice. God controls the sea, the winds, and he knew that God was speaking to him through that. So to go along with that, is there times God has to use different ways to get our attention?
I think God saw Jonah's reluctance, and in a lot of ways, we're the same way.
Yes.
You know, I think Jonah knew what he was getting into. Not that he wasn't going to go, but he didn't want to go because he knew how bad the situation was already. So when you put that into our perspective, we're kind of the same way. We don't want to put ourselves in a situation where we know there's going to be death or, you know, a lot of persecution.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I know, speaking for me, I'm stubborn and hard-headed and don't always want to do something that God calls us to do, because sometimes it requires you to step out, and which requires more faith. It's easy to sometimes just run. Sometimes the hardest part is just saying okay, or saying yes, or send me.
Or assume that he'll send someone else.
Yes, we can. That's something that we probably do quite often is for, I say we, speak about me, is think, well, there's somebody else that God can send to go talk to that individual, or there's somebody else that's more qualified to stand up and speak. But when we try to say that we're doing it, it's not about us. And it makes it a whole lot easier whenever we realize that and quit trying to compare ourselves to somebody else and just know that God's the one doing it. Any other thoughts on that?
I think we gotta try not to argue with God, you know. If we're trying to be obedient, you know, I always pray for more faith or be more obedient or things like that. But when the time comes for when God provides an opportunity for me to do this, am I taking that opportunity? You know, am I putting in the time on my own time at home, you know, studying the Word to build my faith and praying for strength in those times where I can stand strong in the Word. So we have to make sure we're putting in the work ourselves.
Yeah, it's hard to be expected to be used by God if we're not willing to do it. If we're not willing to get into our Word and be prepared. That's good.
Yeah, one thing I want to thank you for filling in tonight. And, you know, God does speak to us in many different ways, and sometimes it's hard to recognize how God is speaking to us and when He's speaking to us.
Yes.
Another thing that we learn here with Jonah, when God is speaking to us, it don't always just involve us. It involves many other people. Jonah here, he would have slept right on through it, I think, but it involved everyone on the ship.
Yeah, and
Troubles on everyone else. So when God speaks to us and means for us to move, many times it affects other people, our family, our friends, outside the church, maybe the church.
absolutely, and we'll touch on that a little bit more as we go into it. So on question 2, did Jonah give any thought to what God told him to do? He thought to flee, yeah. It seemed like that was, first thought that came to was, I'm gone. And he didn't want to go. He caught a ride and thought he was going to try to escape the presence of the Lord.
Yeah, so I was about to read in verse 3, that's what it says, he was trying to get away. How are you going to get away from the presence of the Lord?
You're not. And I'm sure he knew that, and if he didn't, he found out. And sometimes we got to go through that. Sometimes we think that, hey, I'm not going to do this. This ain't for me. But if God's calling you to do it, you can run, but you're not going to escape the presence of the Lord.
Amen.
He also had the consequences of his actions didn't just affect him either.
No,
They
they
were
were
really concerned.
right. And which could have potentially affected a bigger group of people.
Well, even those packages they threw over,
Yeah.
they were probably counting on the other end of the ship coming in, so very interesting.
Right?
Even the minor things that got a lot of people were affected by his actions, disobedience.
So is this any different than what we sometimes do today?
No, I think today as well, we lean on our own understanding more than, or me, speaking of me, I tend to like hindsight's 20/20 type thing, and I always revert back and like, well, I should have went to God with that, you know.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have just, you know, we don't pray on things enough, or we just act out of emotion or things like that, instead of taking the time and letting God speak to us and guide us.
Yeah, I think we miss out on a lot because our first instinct is to do like what Jonah did right here, and that's to run. I know probably a couple years ago, if I would have been asked to do something like this or go to Jamaica, it would have been, I know, God, that's not for me. I'm not doing that. And sometimes that's God speaking to us through somebody else. And instead of us praying about it, that first response is, nope. Any other thoughts on that?
One thing I meant to add a while ago about being able to recognize when God's speaking to you is our heart's not being in tune with God. We let ourselves fall away and not staying in tune, and it goes along with what the brother said. It goes right along with what the brother mentioned a while ago.
Yeah, and what can be some things that cause us to do that?
I think being focused on worldly worries that you have. You know, we sometimes take for granted that God gave us this life to live, and we get caught up in all our worldly possessions and getting to this activity, that activity, and all that stuff, and we forget to sit still and listen to what God has called us to do. And we forget that all the things that we do are supposed to be to glorify Him and to serve Him. And that is when our heart is in tune with the Spirit. But when we get led away by the worldly desires and pleasures and passions and things like that, we get more consumed about what we want and what we desire than what God wants or desires of us.
Yeah. And, we talk about being in our Word and in tune with God. I think the more we're into the Word, the more we're into the prayer, the more we're going to be able to recognize and see what God is calling us to do.
Leaning on your own knowledge and understanding. Scripture says, lean not on your own understanding, and don't let your path stray. Jonah's path was crooked because he was relying on what he thought instead of what God said, what God's word said. And we do that often. We rely on what we think, feel, or know instead of just what Scripture says.
And, through this, I'll use myself a lot as an example, and it may not even be what you think you know, but standing up and not knowing enough. And like you said, it's not what we know. It's leaning on God. And again, all these actions go back to not only affecting us, but they're affecting somebody else who may just be in your path. Here, these guys on this ship, or this boat, they were in his path. He didn't plan it, they were there. You know, we go through our day and we don't know who we're going to come in contact with, but God put us there. And it's like Brother Kevin will talk about with the Great Commission. When you go, you're not just going from where you are now to that place, but in between also, you're still being that light. You're still being that witness. And we've got to be prepared when God calls us to share.
I had heard a while back about, that was something I had missed in the story, is the guys in the boat, they were all lost.
Mm-hmm.
He was the Christian, and he was a Christian sleeping on the job, basically. He could have went witness, but he was caught up in his own problems, running from God, and he wasn't doing his job at all, the Christian. But
Yeah, and
that's how I feel in my own life. Like, I get caught up, busy, like Holly was saying, and, you know, I just totally miss it. But
yeah.
you're just sleeping on a job.
And you see that, you know, he's the Christian, and he goes during this and goes in the middle of a storm and goes to sleep. But these guys up on top, they've got more care for what's going on for each other and for him than what he does for them. He's ready to ride it out down, taking a nap.
You know, the word that comes to my mind is impulse. And we as humans tend to react or act on whatever that impulse is. And we see that a lot in what Jonah's doing.
Yeah.
His first instinct or first impulse is to flee or remove himself or doesn't want to do it.
Yeah.
And we're the same way as humans, I feel. Our first reaction is going to be whatever that impulse is that enters our mind. So the more we're in our Bible, the closer we grow to God, the further those negative impulses, you know, won't affect us as much, which in turn won't affect us either.
Yeah. And going back to something I said earlier, one of those impulses is the word no. We don't want to say yes. It's hard to say yes because then it requires you to do something. It's a whole lot easier to sit back and listen than to go and do. And, you know, God puts things on our heart, and sometimes we ignore that. And we see that the negative effect that can have, not only on ourselves, but others also. So question 3, during the storm, why was it so easy for Jonah to sleep and try to ignore what was being asked of him?
Perhaps an escape mechanism?
Way to escape it?
He was hiding, he was trying to hide from God. It's the same scenario when a child's playing hide and seek with you. They think they're safe under the covers, but you can
Yeah.
still see them. And Jonah's missing the point that God's there at all times. And he's thinking he's actually hiding.
Yeah. Got too many papers up here. So if we're wanting to do God's will and the way it is, hold on. If we were wanting to do God's will, why is it so easy to say no when God's speaking to us?
We like to stay in our comfort zone.
Comfort zone, absolutely,
We always think there's someone else able or capable of it.
yeah.
Fear.
Fear.
I was gonna say anxiety and fear.
Anxiety is fear. All of these have experienced them all the last few days, few weeks.
It's gonna take time, but I think a better word is probably priorities.
Priorities.
I mean, even doubting yourself too. I mean, you may not think that you're capable or that you're kind of relating into somebody else going and doing it, you know.
just saying, well, somebody else would be better at it because I know that I'm not gonna be able to get up here and do this
Right.
the right way. And that's not what God's calling you to do at all.
Because it ain't our way, it's God's way. And, you know, a lot of us go through these emotions, and sometimes it does affect our response to God, whether we do take on what He's asking us to do. And again, who are we affecting?
Goes along with what he said about the doubt that we have. One of the, I feel like the biggest strongholds that Satan has on Christians, or that we sometimes allow Satan to have on us, is we think we're not good at it. You know, there's somebody else more qualified, or more experienced, you know, so we're not good enough to do it.
Right.
I've felt that in my life a lot. When you persevere and you push through, that you realize, you know what, I can do it. But you have to say yes and not
Right.
no to get to that point.
Yeah. And like you said, you're not going to know until you do step out and accept what God's saying to you. And back to time and priorities, we can fill our days with everything except for what God wants. And it gets easier and easier the more we do it. Because then we can just start using that as our main excuse. Well, I don't have time for that because I got this, and this. If we don't make time, we're never going to have time. I mean,
We give them our leftovers.
right. We give him our leftovers. And that's not good enough for God. You know, He deserves much more than that. And I think we need to definitely make a point to give God more than what we do. And if He's speaking to us to go to speak to that person, we've got to do it, because you don't know what tomorrow holds. You may have that friend that God was putting on your heart and you not witness to him. And maybe that was the time. And then 15 years later, you still hadn't done it. You know, God puts somebody on your heart for a reason. And it's not for somebody else to go be that witness to him. Where God puts a request on your heart to go and do something for a reason. And you may not know what that is if you don't do it. When I go through these questions, these were all, it's like every time it was all towards me. Every time God was like, nope, this is it.
You know, you were talking about prioritizing things, and how the more that we have on our plate, the more likely we are to find excuses to not do things. I think if we worded that different, more people would be willing to follow God. So,
Yeah.
example, I don't go to church on Wednesday nights because I don't have time, I have to do this and this and this. If instead we said, I don't go to God on Wednesday nights, because on Wednesday nights I have basketball, I don't do sports, so. I never have basketball. You know, like I didn't go follow God to Jamaica because I had to go get my hair done that day, sorry, you know?
Yeah.
One thought I keep having is, I kind of, you know, I always used to quote, no response is a response. And so, for me, talking about making excuses, what I got really good at, I feel like, is trying to delegate it. So like, yes, I don't know the answer, but let me give it to somebody else. And so I think that's great in some cases, but, you know, if I send someone to you for knowledge, you don't have the same relationship with them that I do. They've come to me for help. And I've been working on that relationship, and I think sometimes talking about somebody else is more qualified, we start trying to sprinkle and throw everybody else at them instead of doing the work ourselves. I mean, we, without even meaning to, have built these relationships with people, and then we just kind of panic. That's what I you panic. You just panic. I mean,
Right.
let me give you to Google and I can look up all these different scriptures, maybe, give me a second and let me send you to the pastor. He knows all the questions, he'll answer it, he's got 500 books in his library. You know, I'm guilty of that, thinking that I'm responding in some way, but really I'm failing to move
Yeah.
and be obedient myself.
Yeah, the fear of not knowing what may be asked, what they're going to throw at you. God calls you to go witness to somebody, and they may be an atheist that doesn't believe a single word, who studies the word more than you do, and comes and attacks you with all kinds of questions. There's the fear of that, but who are we leaning on? Are we leaning on ourselves, or are we leaning on God? And when we don't know the question, do we just leave it alone and move on? No, that's where we dig in and we get it, and then we take it back to Him.
Even if we don't know the exact words to say, you can still express what God's done for you in your life to them. Hopefully, and that will relate in a way. Then you can go back with the true or with the answers that if you don't know right at the time.
Yeah.
That's what I do a lot of times. I just because I don't have all the answers either. But if someone comes to me, I tell them about what God's done for me in my life, how He's blessed me in my life since,
Yeah, I had a conversation with a person who, his dad was a pastor, and he grew up in the church, and then ended up rejecting the faith and turning from God, not knowing this, and I go and talk to him and want to pray with him, and that's what he hit me with. And he knew the word because he grew up with his dad in church. And so we just worked through questions that he had and thoughts he had, and we prayed, and it's easy to turn away from it. But we've got to lean on God and go where He's calling us. So question 4, what do we see happen the longer Jonah ran from God? Things got worse. No matter where they tried to go, it got worse. Back to shore, it got worse.
Yeah, God just didn't go away.
No, he wasn't able to get away from the presence of God. We can run, we can try to run, we can try to escape the presence, but it's not going to get easier.
I've heard this said before about this text, about sleeping Christian. And we assume that Jonah is a Christian, God using him in different ways, yet he's sleeping on the boat. But sleeping Christians, him being somebody else about what everybody else on the boat thought.
Yeah.
Supposing that they're not Christian. Well, we know they turn to their gods. So, what are we sleeping on as Christians?
Yeah.
It's funny that they turn to their gods, but Jonah didn't turn to his.
No, he just wanted to sleep it away. It's his way of running. So how are we affected the longer we put off what God is asking us to do?
Depends on whether you can shut it off like John did, and let all these other people take responsibility, and we need to step up and realize that, like we did at the end, that this is me.
Yeah.
He ignored it for a while, granted, but
And the more,
I think either way you look at it, the more you tell God no, the easier it gets.
yeah, the further away you get, the less you hear it, the easier it is to just turn away.
And when I say no, it means it's easier to say no to God. But in Jonah's case, the situation got a lot worse.
It's like sin. At first we hear it real loud. The more you stay in it, quieter it gets, before you know, you don't hear it, and you continue in it. Same thing with what God's calling you to do. You know, first it was really loud. You might even gave it some thought. Then the longer you said no, easier it got, the quieter it seemed before it was gone. So, but also the effect it has on other people. I can remember a story that one of my Sunday school teachers, when I went to church at Warm Springs, she worked here in Pocahontas and lived in Missouri. And so every day she'd get off from the hospital, she'd drive home, and she'd go past this house. And God put it on her heart. You need to stop here and witness to this guy. And I'm too tired, not tonight. She was a nurse, working 12-hour shifts. And each time she'd drive by, not today, tomorrow. Well, before she stopped and witnessed to the man, he passed away. And she shared it with us, and it ate her up because she didn't stop and do what God asked her to do. What he's asking you to do, you may not have tomorrow to do it. If he's calling for you to do something tonight, do it. If it's to reach out to that person that you haven't spoken to, reach out to them. If God's putting on your heart, it's for a reason. God put it on her heart, but she came up with different reasons why not to. And we're guilty of the same thing. Hopefully we don't have to experience that. Working in healthcare, I get plenty of opportunities to be a light to my patients. I see them 3-4 times a week, every week. And for the longest time, I took advantage of that and didn't take the opportunity to share God or to be that light. Going through D group, it helped me to be able to start to open up and to see what God was giving me at my work. I didn't have to go to Jamaica to be a disciple, to be a missionary. God put me in a place with these individuals that I see 3 or 4 times a week, every week. And so I got to where I was being able to be a witness. And unfortunately, there was times where I didn't talk to somebody. And I knew they weren't in the right place from the fruits. And they pass away before I ever talked to them. So we got to take advantage of where God has us right now and allow God to use us and speak through us. Question 5. Was God being glorified even though Jonah was running? And if so, how?
I would say yes, because, it is said that they suppose that the people he was with, they believed in the God of, well, I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, which was their sky god. And so he made it a purpose to say that, he, feared the Lord God of heaven, or God of heaven, who made the sea and dry land. He ultimately witnessed to those people, and it doesn't specifically say through, but in the end, when they threw him over, they did end up, offering sacrifice to the Lord and taking vow, which we would assume that he would probably testify, told them a little bit more about God and what it said.
Yeah. Yeah, we see at the beginning during the storm that they're crying out to their little g gods. And then, as she said, there at the end, they're crying out and offering sacrifices to the God. So even through Jonah's actions, God still was glorified. And so when God asks us to do something, is it for our own glorification or God's? Pretty easy question to answer. But a lot of times, said I'm speaking about myself a lot, we make it about ourselves. We make it about our abilities or lack of, instead of knowing that this is for God and God's going to be glorified because He's calling you to do it. He's going to use you and He'll be glorified. Regardless of what you think about yourself or how you're going to do, God will be glorified. And we see it right here. Any other thoughts? All right, so I'm going to go to chapter 3. Only got a couple questions here. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it the message that I tell you. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, 3 days' journey in breadth. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's journey, and he called out, Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And the people of Nineveh believed God. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest of them to the least of them. The word reached the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. And he issued a proclamation and published through Nineveh by the decree of the king and his nobles, Let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed or drink water. But let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and let them call out mightily to God. Let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hands. Who knows, God may turn and relent and turn from his fierce anger, so that we may not perish. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it. So was there any hesitation the second time the word of the Lord came to Jonah? No. So what changed?
He knew he couldn't hide.
Couldn't hide? Everything he just went through? I would say that's pretty life-changing.
I think he actually repented in chapter 1, verse 9. You know, he says, I'm Hebrew and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. I think it was there where you realize, you know, this is gonna have to change.
Yeah.
And I think that's when the other sailors, you know, people realize, that things are different too. Going, throw himself overboard for their sake.
So what will it take for us to not hesitate and to do what God is asking of us?
I think we gotta take the I out of the equation. It's not
Yeah.
about us, it's about God. and
Right.
What he is asking us or calling us to do.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with us, we're just a vessel to spread the word of God.
And we've got to be a willing vessel to do that. As Christians, we want to be used by God, right? We want to be that witness, that light in our workplace, in our homes. We want to be the leader of our children, and we've got to do it, and we've got to use God. It's nothing that we can do on our own, but we've got to be willing to do it. We've got to have that eagerness and not the thought of chapter 1, verse 1, turning and running. That's the easy way out, but it's not the best way out. It's not the way that God wants.
God was pretty heavy-handed to Jonah throughout, like 1 and 2. Jonah was running from him. kinda reminds me of Tegan, and it's like, hey man, quit, you know, and then he thinks I'm kidding, and thinks I'm kidding, and thinks I'm kidding, and finally, I have to get a little heavy-handed with him, and he quits, and he
Yeah.
understands, he respects me after that, has some respect for me, so, in saying that, God told Jonah, hey, you need to quit, you need to listen to me, and he created the storm, and then he went overboard and was swallowed up by a fish, and he just had time to pray for 3 days. And on that third day, you know, after he got through praying, he, you know, put him on dry land, but he had to take that time and that realization and that heavy-handed from God to say, hey, you know, I know you're serious. And it's, and on another thought, it's easy to be, Holly made me think of it a while ago, but it's easy to be a full-time employee. It's easy to be a full-time dad. It's easy to be a full-time husband. It's easy to be full-time, fill in the blank. Everybody's a full-time something.
Right.
But, I mean, I know myself, I'm hardly a part-time Christian sometimes. And it's like, you know, how can I be a full-time of all of this stuff, but I can't get part of my time to God.
Yeah, that's where we get, you know, we all got those full times, different things, but we've all got them. So with all that full-time stuff, why can't we make God full-time involved in all that? We can. We just have to do it. A whole lot easier said than done. So when Jonah made it to Nineveh, how did the people respond?
They did not do what Jonah expected them to do, I don't think.
Or maybe not even what he wanted them to do.
Yeah.
There was a big turn. They turned from their wicked ways, their evilness. And are we always going to see these kind of results? So do we let what we think will happen stop us from reaching out?
Yeah, we did.
We'd like to say no. We shouldn't. But I can tell you that for a long time, God called me to go speak to my grandpa, who wanted absolutely nothing at all to do with God. And you talk about running from it. Every time I felt God told me to do it, I had something else I had to do. And I let what I think he was going to say, think he was going to do, stop me from wanting to go share. And
that's that fear, the fear from what will or will not happen.
yeah.
I think when you look at the big picture of this, you realize how God started this whole conversation of wanting him to go. I think God knew that their hearts were ready. I know that he knew that their hearts were ready, and there was urgency in that situation. So he wanted Jonah to get there. He didn't want him to doubt or be reluctant. And I think that just proves a lot. You know, the journey that it took him to get there, as hard as he fought it, the outcome, you know, God already knew what the outcome was going to be. So, you know, that in turn gives us, you know, when we're reluctant to go through a situation like that, and we bring a lot of it on ourselves, you know, I mean, moral to the story is Jonah could have saved himself a lot of trouble, you know, if he had just listened and did what, but then the road would have been too easy. Sometimes I can't take the easy road.
No.
I find out the hard way.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's just who we are as humans. We tend to do that.
You know, and that can go with who God's calling you to go speak to.
I think also, I know we've said a lot of times we get self-centered essentially, but when you look at the difference of someone's eternal life versus 20 minutes of awkward, uncomfortable, you're not in your element, you know?
Yep.
And I'm so thankful because the person who did witness to me went out of their element, like it literally was my patient and I was there to take care of her. And
she took better care of me,
Yeah.
you know?
Yes.
So, I mean, some awkward moment, but for their eternal salvation.
Yeah.
So John took a storm and a big fish. Now I think, there was a question earlier about, knowing when God's talking to us. But if we avoid when God is trying to reach us, then sometimes he sends bigger storms
Yep.
in our lives. And it can come in a number of ways. But he can also just send people. He can send, Brother Kevin's message, or just a friend at work, or anything can happen in our lives. But again, we just have to be open to hearing that. And unfortunately, sometimes it is a big storm,
Right.
you know.
That's all I have. So we've mentioned quite a bit about, how God can speak to us and God using other people to speak to us. And sometimes we're quick to say no. And we miss that that's God using that person to speak to us. So if that happens, let no not be your first thought. Let running not be your first thought, but prayer. Let prayer be your first thought. Give it to God and see what he tells you to do. And if there's that person that God has on your heart to reach out to, don't wait. If they don't want to talk about it, keep praying. Don't stop praying for them. Let God move and be the vessel that he works through. Andrew, do you care to close us out?
Dear Lord, thank you so much that we can come and have a Bible lesson tonight, Lord. And thank you for Kent being faithful and leading us through it, Lord. And just pray that we can take this lesson and apply it to our lives, Lord. And when you call on us, Lord, just pray that we'll be faithful to follow you, Lord, and that we will be faithful and always stay prayerful for you, Lord, and just study your word so that when you call on us, we may have the answers that we need and just be able to be the light that you call us to be, Lord, and go where you have us to be. Lord, I just pray that you go with us, with the rest of the league, Lord. Keep us safe, Lord, and these things I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
I skipped.